Pointed like this side.
I'm wearing a Westboro tie. It's the illegal W.
Good evening and welcome to this tri-board meeting this evening, a meeting of the Select Board, Advisory Finance Committee, and the School Committee. Just to note that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed by Westboro TV. Scheduled for 6 p.m. The agenda was posted in time, and we are slightly after 6, so kicking this off this evening. So I welcome our Advisory Finance Committee, our School Committee, and my fellow Select Board members here this evening. If I could ask all those are able to please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, I'm going to kick this off real quick so we can get to the meat of the agenda, but then also see if the chair of the AFC, Mike Beretti, and the chair of the school committee, Lisa Edinburgh, want to add anything. But really the format this evening for folks, if those recall from prior years, this is really a meeting, kind of the kickoff for our budget season to really set the stage of where we are regarding the closeout of the fiscal year 2022 budget, and then update of our estimates for fiscal year 2023, and then really talking about the fiscal year 2024 kind of budget pressures and priorities. And thank you to the department heads that are all here this evening. Appreciate you being here and taking time out in your Thursday evening. So just to remind folks, kind of the goal of this summit is to bring together these 3 boards as well as the department heads to develop a common understanding of the fiscal year 2024 budget priorities and pressures, and to do this before the budget process begins. Before we started this process, we were kind of doing it as we were putting budgets together, or it came out for a message from the town manager, and we just felt this was a proper way to do it before any numbers were put on paper or whatever, to really get these committees together with the department heads and all hear the same thing as we prepare to start the process. So that's all I had to say. Michael, do you have anything?
Just to echo your thanks to all the department heads and the committee members for attending tonight. It is an important meeting, and we're glad we can do it, and thank you again, guys.
Lisa?
I was simply going to say the same thing. Thank you all. I appreciate everyone.
And one thing I was asked to remind folks on, especially you sitting out there, is if you're speaking, just to lean into the microphones. They don't pick up as well. And for us in the audience, if we can't hear it on the speakers here, then the folks on TV can't hear it as well. So just ask folks to make sure they speak into the microphones. Okay, with that, we'll kick it off with the presentation of fiscal year 2022 budget closeout.
Good evening. I'm going to start with talking about the fiscal 22 budget closeout, which is its year ended on June 30th, 2022. This chart here shows a comparison of fiscal 21 to 22. So the free cash was available to us in fiscal 21 was about $400,000 more than fiscal, that was available to us in fiscal 22 was about $400,000 more than fiscal 21. We saw a 7.33% increase in our operating budget in fiscal 22 over fiscal 21, and a 3.25% increase in the average single family tax bill, which was $10,328. Our excess levy capacity did increase by about 1.5 million. When we look at our free cash at the end of fiscal 2022, Compared to our data dashboard communities, you'll see that Westboro is still in the high end compared to our data dashboard communities at about 13.6 million. And then looking at our average single family tax bill for fiscal 22, we were right below the middle. Excess levy capacity was strong in fiscal 22 at the 13.7 million. So that's how we closed out the year in fiscal 22.
Any questions for the town manager on that closeout, any of those numbers?
Great. And looking at budget updates, for budget estimate updates for fiscal 23, just a reminder that our fiscal 23 budget did receive the Distinguished Budget Presentation Award. Thank you. Thanks to everybody. The department heads work really hard on that. So one of the things we talked a lot about when we were preparing for fiscal 23 was our residential and commercial values. So this is our updated number for fiscal 23. So 3.72 billion for residential and 1.49 billion for commercial industrial. So still looking at that split that we had anticipated, 28.5% commercial and 71.5% residential. The slide you've all been waiting for. So this is our estimated average single family increase for fiscal 23. There's 3 lines that have been added since annual town meeting. So we've added the annual town meeting estimate of $1,090 as an increase to the average single family. The blue line next to it is the estimate as of today, which is $876 to the average single family. And then that gray line estimates the average single family increase if the raise and appropriate articles identified at town meeting were to pass. But it's important to acknowledge that that does not include the raise and appropriate for the police department article because we don't have a number at this point. Updated fiscal 23 total town reserves. Our free cash has exceeded our goal, is at 14% of our general fund. Stabilization is at 3.4%, and the combined, we're at 17.4%, which is above our goal of 10 to 15% of the general fund. Just a reminder that we haven't had an opportunity to use any of our free cash in this year because we haven't held a town meeting in fiscal 23. So this is the number that goes down at special town meeting in October, and then we'll go down again when we fund our capital plan in March. One of the things that we wanted to raise for the annual town meeting, but for discussion going forward from tonight, is that consideration could be given to increasing the stabilization to at least meet that 5% goal using free cash, which would be a transfer of approximately 1.8 million. This is the reserve summary that you see in the Finance Committee books at town meeting. And so you'll see that this does anticipate the transfers of free cash and also retained earnings. And so already that percentage is going down from the 17.4 to 17.1. This is our anticipated change in excess levy capacity. So in fiscal 22, we were at that 13.7. Fiscal 23, we're estimated to use about $89,000 of our excess levy capacity.
Thank you, Christy. Any questions on any of those numbers or comments? Seeing none, move on.
Okay. So the bulk of our presentation is really identifying priorities and pressures for fiscal 24. So I'm going to speak. Also, our DPW director, Chris Payne's going to speak, and then our superintendent, Amber Bach, to really give you a holistic view of what pressures we anticipate for fiscal 24. Our first slide just indicates that we would see increases even if we presented a level service budget. So even if we provide all of the same services that we provide now with all of the same level of staff, we would anticipate increases in common areas. So one of those is wage and salary increases. This is due to contracts as well as COLAs that were apportioned in fiscal 24 or will be. Health insurance increases. We're seeing inflation in medical care, and so we anticipate a premium increase due to that. Our enrollment numbers continue to rise. It's something that we saw throughout the pandemic, and certainly that has a lot to do with people's individual situations related to their families and potentially being laid off during the COVID pandemic. Also, our claims history, that's something that we certainly can't control, but it does control our premiums. So we have seen a significant month, and that's why, as you remember, as we get closer to town meeting, we try to get more and more claims history. So we are constantly changing that number as we get closer to setting the budget. And then the rising cost of goods and services, which everyone's experiencing in your personal lives, we're also experiencing in the municipality. So inclusive of those are fuel, equipment costs, materials and supplies, our service contracts we've seen go up over the past couple of years, and then also our property, casualty, and liability insurance. On the town side, we have some very minimal COVID-19 budget restoration. Professional development is something that we didn't add fully back last year. We also weren't seeing people traveling or attending conferences as much. And as we sort of figure out what that space is going to look like in the future, there's potential to add back professional development, but certainly looking at what our associations are offering and making sure that we're being responsible in terms of how that adds back. Opeb funding, I'll talk about a little bit more in the presentation. As you all know, we adopted an Opeb funding schedule and plan as part of our comprehensive fiscal management policy. So we're going to see that as a pressure in FY24. Some minimal overtime increases, and then some miscellaneous expenses. We also have 4 open contracts on the town side, the clerical, DPW, patrol officers, and police supervisors. They do expect to complete the police supervisors for this upcoming October town meeting. And then we have 1 union contract that will expire on June 30th of 23. So for fiscal 24, we would anticipate an increase based on any settlement of negotiations with the firefighters. Focusing on insurance, we wanted to point out some of the things that we've done since 2010 to try to decrease those costs. Just as a reminder, the town does pay 75% of the premiums for health insurance. The employee pays 25%. And then we also offer that as a post-employment benefit. So we pay 75% of the retiree premium costs as well. I won't go through these word for word, but we've certainly done a lot of work in partnership with our unions and our insurance advisory committee to increase co-pays, set up flexible spending and opt-out programs. We've changed carriers twice when we found it advantageous to do so. We've moved our retirees as well onto different plans when we found it advantageous to do so. In 2021, we created criteria for future enrollment in PPO plans. That's our most expensive plan. So now you have to meet certain criteria to even be enrolled in that plan. And then in 2022, we actually added a high deductible plan option. So that's significantly lower, or that's lower premiums. So it's a savings to both the town and the employee. We also offer a health savings account, which the town is committed to fund an amount equal to half the deductible for 2 years. Also looking at our Opeb, as I mentioned earlier, our Opeb liability is estimated in FY22 to be $123 million. In 2015, when we made health insurance changes where we moved to Tufts because we were recognizing savings, we actually took that savings and put it into the budget as a beginning to fund Opeb. So that's that 1.1 million that we often talk about. And so we did continue to fund at 1.1 million in the budget, so raise and appropriate. until COVID. And as you all know, in COVID, we did remove that from the budget to recognize savings as we moved through the pandemic. So that's something that we've spent a lot of time talking about, how we would start to fund our Opeb liability and bring that back into the budget. In February of 22, we adopted our Opeb funding strategy. So that had gone through both the review of the finance team, the finance committee, and then adopted by the select board. And so you'll see here as a reminder that the funding schedule that we adopted in FY24 would call for $200,000 to be added to the insurance budget as a raise and appropriate, and also an article to move $200,000 of free cash into the Opeb trust fund. The goal is to get back to that 1.1 million fully funded through the budget, and that's anticipated for FY29. Other parts of that funding strategy is that we do have employees that are currently paid out of water, sewer, and the Country Club enterprise funds. So something that we had not done previously but will do going forward is to charge those funds for those employees' post-employment benefits. In fiscal 23, that was the first year that we also started adding $5,000 to the budget for each new benefited position. So not new employee. So if you replaced an employee, then you were not it was not added. But if you were a fully new position, we would add $5,000 to the budget. So in FY23, we added $25,000 to the budget because we added 5 new positions between the town and the school. And so going forward, any new positions, we would continue to add that $5,000 in order to start to fund the Opeb liability, the new liability that's being created by creating new positions. The unfunded pension liability, which we currently fund, is expected to be fully funded before June 30th of 2035. And so our plan and part of our comprehensive fiscal management policy is, and the plan for many other communities in the Commonwealth is to move that money that was previously budgeted for the pension, the unfunded pension liability over to the Opeb trust funds. And so we believe that that redirection of funds would actually meet or exceed that $1.1 million.
Sorry, just a quick question. If a position disappears because we no longer need that position, do you not add are you balancing or are you just adding 5,000?
The current policy doesn't contemplate a position going away, but certainly we would talk about that.
Right, because I mean, that's a choice of do we keep only adding for new positions or do we count the number of positions total?
Well, so the pension liability is calculated by an actuary for all the existing positions. So we're adding $5,000 for the new positions that we would carry forward.
Yeah, but if your total count were, if there was some position you destroyed in one, took away in one department, and then you added another position in a different department, is that a net zero, or is that one new position?
Oh, so that I understand now. So that would not be a new position. So as an example, a real example, in our office, we had 2 administrative assistants. One of them retired. We did not replace the administrative assistant with an administrative assistant, but rather with a management analyst communications assistant. So that would not be a net increase. Yeah. So in our first slide, we talked about the things that would increase if we had a level service budget. So I've talked about health insurance and I talked about wages. And then now we're going to talk about sort of goods and services and infrastructure, maintenance and investments. So Chris has a few slides here to talk about some assessing he's done in his department.
Good evening, everybody. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak here. I'm not up here to present some big number at the end, so you don't have to sweat that. I'm just here to really provide some information and some context. On the slide at the bottom, it says improved understanding of requirements and make informed decisions. So as we move forward, not only this year, but in future years, The intent for what I'm about to discuss is really just to give some big picture look at what we're doing, and we can compare things to benchmarks as opposed to just having nothing to compare to. So I'm first going to answer the question about the cost of maintaining the town's infrastructure. I'll talk very briefly about near-term budget impacts, but there's not a whole lot identified right now, but I will hit that. So the approach we take, and I'm going to walk you through it, is we've identified all our assets. Then we established a value for all of those assets. And then based on what we identified from industry best practice is that if you take the value of all your assets, about 1% to 2% of that would give you a ballpark for how much your budget should be. And another 1% to 2% would give you a ballpark for how much your capital improvement budget should be. So those two together at the bottom of the screen, that example there. So if you used 1% as your benchmark, then you'd have an operating budget that's based on 1% of that total value, plus another 1% of that same value to give you your total of those two combined. Hopefully that makes sense. So this is just a snapshot to tell you how that we've captured our assets and identified them. And if you ask the question, why didn't we do this last year? How come this is the first time we're talking about it? And the reason why is because we needed to identify all those assets. So we've spent the last several years capturing this data. You all funded tablets and other things that we've used to do this. So the picture on the right is from several years ago, and the picture on the picture on the left is several years ago, and the picture on the right is current. And more dots means more stuff. And so it really doesn't matter what those dots are right now, but the point is that we've spent a lot of time collecting, verifying, validating those assets in the field, and now we've got a pretty clear understanding of what we have. And just for reference, two pictures on the bottom, the rotary is about right here. So this is really just a really small section of downtown. So to the methodology, so we identified all the assets. Now we want to establish values and estimate funding. So this chart here shows in the macro all of our assets, and we've put a value to them. We either used a consultant-provided number that's kind of an industry number, or we used information the town has. So for example, the buildings, which is about 3 lines down, we just went off the assessor database. So this number here, 32 million, that's what we're using to say is the value of all of our town buildings, not including the schools. So I think that number is probably pretty low, but we needed a number to start with. And so what the numbers we're going to come up with based on that as an example are probably pretty conservative in my mind, but at least it gives us something to talk about. So we get a total here in this red circle of $300 million basically. So if you use that methodology we talked about to begin with, under the estimate, if you take 1% to 2% for your operations, that's 3 to 6 million, and another 3 to 6 million for your capital, and you get a total of $6 to $12 million, which is what we would say is a start point for discussion about a budget that would allow us to do our operations and allow us to do our capital improvements, right? So the number on the right is what we're budgeted at now, and you can see there's a delta there, and I'm not planning to come in 2 months and ask for another $2 million. Again, all I'm trying to do here is give us something to benchmark ourselves, and so when we do ask for, say, another $20,000 or $50,000, it doesn't, at least in my mind, it's not necessarily a crazy number, even though it may sound like a lot of money to the town. And this is hopefully something that helps us understand that, right? So that's why we're showing it. This is just, so the next 2 slides just cover the other 2 budgets we manage, the sewer budget. So again, 244 million, and then on the left in green is that range that we would think is appropriate based on that methodology of total value of our assets, and on the right is our current budget. This particular budget here, I think we are probably on the low end, a little too low. I'm not going to give you a number right now that I think it should be, but I think it needs to increase over time, and that's something we'll talk about it over time, but that's this number, that's the sewer. And then water, pretty healthy here, it seems, but 239 million, between 5 and 10 million would be the industry estimate, and then 6 million is where we're at right now. And our capital drives a large part of that. So in summary, I guess my point is that we are using a methodology to help us kind of gauge where we are in our budget. Besides looking at what we spend and how much things cost and all that sort of thing, this is kind of a much bigger look at it. And as it points out here, it gives us just a benchmark, a reference point to compare ourselves to. In terms of near-term budget considerations, which I know is the real focus for tonight, Christy mentioned the inflation, so that's just going to be built into whatever we come to the table with. And then I'm pretty confident we're going to need to ask for some increased funds for our building operations and maintenance. And I know for the Finance Committee and the Select Board, I've been in front of you a few times already and alluded to that. I don't know what that number is. It's not going to be $2 million, but it is going to be a request for increased funding. And that will be a discussion in the near future. So that's all I have. Subject to any questions.
Thanks, Chris. Steve?
As a budget tool, it makes sense, but you're also going to have to figure out how to make it grow in the future based on either escalation or the fact that if we do nothing, we have aging infrastructure, which requires more and more maintenance, as well as some program by which we would make capital improvements to remove things that have died in their use. So have you gone beyond this tool right now in terms of how to make it work in the same methodology going forward?
The basic answer is no, but I guess I'm not entirely clear what you're asking. Well, let me say what I think you're asking, which is that as the years go by, these numbers will change and we'll have to update them. So the answer to that would be yes, we will update them over time, but I don't know if that really got to your point.
Well, yeah, other than going back to say, okay, the same buildings that you've estimated at 32 million, 5 years from now, maybe 40 million, say. But on the other hand, they're also older by that many years, and therefore the trade-off between your increased budget will have some kind of a trend line that's different than, say, the normal escalation, if you will, of the valuation of the equipment. So
Yep.
As a tool today, it works very well to make that comparison, but if you're going to use the same methodology going forward, you're going to have to figure out how to adjust it so that, in fact, the tool that you want it to be will be useful in future years as well.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I think for the near term, though, the purpose is not really to quote these numbers specifically. It's to just give some context to where we sit in terms of how much money we spend. Because the reason, I appreciate speaking here tonight is because oftentimes it's very difficult to understand what all the money we spend goes to. Because it's all buried and it ages quickly, and because it's underground, most of it ages even faster. But we don't see that, and so it's difficult to sometimes wrap our heads around that. So by kind of communicating this information, the intent is really just to give some broader context that there's a whole lot of stuff out there. It's getting older, and if we don't maintain it or replace it when the time is right, then at the end, it's just going to cost us more money because we're doing it as an emergency, or it becomes a crisis for the town in terms of something not working the way it should when we need it to. But point well taken.
And Chris, in that sewer line, is that exclusive of wastewater treatment plant, or is that inclusive in that line?
Exclusive, Yes.
That's just another thing to think about from an infrastructure
Correct.
perspective that's not on there.
Yep.
Outside of your
Correct.
department, but very much related to.
Yep. So everything outside the fence of the wastewater treatment plant that I know some people went to, that's us. Everything inside is a separate budget.
Thanks. Rod?
Yeah, Chris, I just wondered if there are any other metrics, similar communities in terms of, not to say we need to emulate, but just any metrics in terms of how much they spend based on their infrastructure versus how much we spend. That might be helpful.
We do, I don't have anything to show you, but we do look at other communities. Unfortunately, it's not really apples to apples in a lot of cases because everybody's organized differently and everybody seems to have their own way of, or thing, like the Public Works doesn't do the same thing in every town. And so it's a little more difficult. You have to really go into the eaches, and it can be done, but it just, it's not as easy as you like it to be just to say, how's Northborough do it and how we compare. But we do that kind of internally, yes.
Is there any way to do an analysis of what the cost of deferred maintenance is? Because obviously we don't spend money now, we have to spend it later. And, you know, it's future, I totally know it's guessing in the future, but at the same time, sometimes that money is more expensive on the next group of people who have to pay it if we don't pay it now.
Yep, we have several different studies, road, water, and sewer, that give us those numbers. I don't have them in front of me, but we do have those numbers captured, so we know what they are.
Okay, that would be helpful, I think, to us when you're presenting the budget.
Okay.
Other questions?
All right, thank you.
Chris, thank you. Amber, you're on.
You're on.
Good to see all of you tonight. We were over there looking at cost escalation, following up on the last question, because we had a meeting today around Hastings, and we were also looking at roof projects. And this morning, they quoted us 15% annual escalation cost for each year you wait as of now. So they were carrying calculations when they met with us of a 15% escalation on the roof estimate they gave us. So the costs are certainly substantial to deferred maintenance as a piece of kind of where we are. So it's good to see all of you tonight. Similarly to Chris, I think I'm up, as we all are, at kind of a 10,000-foot view to welcome you to budget season, to answer questions, and to give you kind of preliminary look at areas we think are going to be bigger ticket items for us. And Christy certainly framed the overview of the state of the town, and it always feels good to follow Chris because he has these large numbers he has to put up on the board, and I appreciate that. We have 6 large buildings, and so I feel like any number that we put in front of you has an escalation and a cost that's pretty staggering. So for us today, the goal would be just to call out for you kind of areas of potential impact that we're starting to assess and look at in the budget. We're currently looking at 3 major areas, and 2 of them, you know, will impact 24, depending on what we do in 23. So it's hard to give solids right now on some of them. One will be negotiations, student service costs, and capital. So I'm just going to give you kind of a few items on each of these. So currently, similarly to Christy, we are in contract negotiations with all of our bargaining units. So we're currently actively engaged with the teaching unit, Unit A, which is our largest bargaining unit. It is our hope to have that contract settled and available to us by the March town meeting. Additionally, the administrator's contract, which is not for the administrator's contract, this is assistant principals and student service coordinators. So there's a small administrative negotiation unit, not the majority of the administrators in the district, not principals, none of the central office people, but the administrators in that unit, assistant principals, have a small unit. Their contract actually expired last year, so we're in negotiations with them. Theirs will be retro to this year, and then they did a 2-year contract, so they'll get back in alignment with all the units being at the same time. All the other units are in the queue. I imagine the next largest unit we need to work with is paraprofessionals, and I talked to their unit, and it should be starting shortly. We certainly see a wide range of settlements across our like communities. We look to all of our comparative districts in the like communities, and some of them are actively negotiating now, some have settled, and they're pretty wide ranging. Early ones were pretty advantageous in the mid-2s, and others are ranging upward as we see inflation and negotiations and job markets getting tight. So I think the negotiation framework for actively right now for Unit A people is advantageous to keep moving and getting them done as soon as possible. For those of you that were with us before, I'll just go back for a minute to negotiations. You remember we made a committed effort to have a really well-settled contract with our teachers in the last negotiation because we were trying to pull back in alignment with our like communities. We made good substantial progress in that last contract. I don't think that we have the same kind of escalation needs as we did before. We're much closer to our like communities, but it certainly is a very competitive hiring district for us in terms of the area, and so we certainly need to stay close. Special education. So we've certainly been actively engaged in a conversation around out-of-district tuition costs and some unanticipated escalations of expenditures in this current year. And we're finishing discussions on that and of course seeking your support coming into fall town meeting. The outcome of that vote obviously dictates a lot about what happens for us in terms of 24. So we have all sorts of projections and analysis to try to prepare for all the different ways that we would move forward. With special education, you would anticipate too that we also have to wait and see where the circuit breaker number comes in. So it's not released yet. So the number that we will use to build FY24 usually comes out really any time now. And it usually gets settled what percentage of the total they're going to give us. We submit it, but what the percentage that they're going to give back, it could go anywhere from 70 to 85. Like we would love to be, in the higher end. So once that number comes out, it solidifies the gap that we'll look at in special education. So we're calling this out now because one, you've seen we've had the issue that we've brought forward for discussion, but we still have to wait and see where circuit breaker comes out as well. And that will really, those two things, town meeting and circuit breaker really define the gap in special education. We also will be looking, as we always do, and this is kind of future discussion, we're really at 10,000 feet now. We always start tracking when students will rotate out of service, who's moved in. There's always kind of an ebb and flow to that service delivery that's important, and we always have the unspecified component of move-ins. So, there's kind of a very dynamic impact to that number. And lastly, the other area for us that has large impact for everyone and is part of working very closely with the town to develop a more comprehensive, really 5 and then 10-year plan, as Kim has discussed developing and is working with the committee on. A couple things to note in this arena. Again, how we move forward at town meeting in the fall will dictate some of the trajectory of cost impacts on these decisions around what would go into our capital submission on October 11th. So again, they're coming in front of each other, and we'll just have to wait and see how to amend those based upon votes at town meeting. But when you look at this, similarly, we have one important piece is that we're waiting on the completion of an updated capital assessment. So we have an RFQ out currently to establish, similarly to as Chris was saying, you really want to come in, you have to look at all of your assets, you have to see the value and the need and the current updates that need to be done on all of your properties. And the last one we did is now tapped out. It's 9 years old, and we really are beyond its capacity to serve us in terms of any reality of numbers. So we have an RFQ. We've talked about this a couple times. We have an RFQ out. We anticipate that extensive report, which again grounded a lot of our decision-making over the last 7 years, will give us a new template to let us resort our capital, working with Kim and the committee and the school committee to make sure we have a stronger handle on the order of operations for things that need to be done across all of our buildings. And that was a pretty comprehensive look. It certainly partners nicely with the assessments that the town did on ADA, and it will echo some of that and confirm what each of those schools need to accomplish in terms of both repairs and any upgrades. So that will happen during the span of the year. And so I feel like by the time we come to the end of the year and looking into next year, our capital assessments will be updated. It's certainly good news that one of the reasons it needs to be updated is because we've accomplished a lot of work over the last 7 years. So the other ones that we call out are ones that we'll be talking about as they relate to partially to the request. But if you look at the immediate list of capital that are large ticket items, you have obviously you see Hastings as a package, and you see 2 high school projects that are component pieces of our capital planning that have kind of been bumping back and forth as we've moved priorities around. We shifted the Hastings roof because we needed to tackle the Armstrong roof. So now we're coming back, we're getting new cost estimates. In today's meeting, we looked at the trajectory of how we need to package the HVAC, the roof, and all the other updates there into an orderly fashion and what the total package of cost will be. So I'm going to bring that fresh information back on Monday to Select Board, and then I'll attend I'll go to FinCom afterwards, and we can discuss those numbers more in depth. Certainly that impacts the role of our submission for capital into the following years. So again, it's kind of a magnitude of scale. When you look at the numbers that Chris was providing just a minute ago, if, you know, I was just leaning right before he said, I think that number is low. I was like, 32 million for all our buildings. I think that's low. I think one of our buildings is that. You know, so you're looking at an escalation of cost for the care of 6 of them, and certainly some need less than others, as certainly fails should need precious little for a while. So again, those are the types of things that we'll be assessing. So those are the 3 big ticket items that we're kind of currently, 2 of them related to fall town meeting that will then trigger a second tier of decisions for us and will impact where we start the base of building the budget. And those are mine for tonight.
Great. Questions for Amber? Yep.
You had a slide up regarding mental health. Can you speak to the specifics of?
Sure. The student services cost and the impact of the out-of-district placement is really a referral to some of the compounding of one we had of the, you know, we've discussed kind of that trajectory of those 9 students who placed out. The trajectory of some of those student placements are mental health composite related, mostly young students with mental health, where it's much harder to have a built-in infrastructure of supports, and thus really escalated into meriting some out-of-district placement. So, you know, they cluster around a combination of some of the mental health service needs that required out-of-district placement. Like typically internalized support services for a wide array of student disabilities are built in effectively across all of our schools. And if you go towards the upper trajectory, when you hit really Gibbons and into the high school, we have a pretty solid infrastructure of mental health supports and variable programs and wraparound services. The infrastructure for that down at the 3 elementary schools is much more shallow, historically because of less need. So then we saw this sudden escalation of students with like school phobia, resistance to attending, struggle breakdowns, physical issues, home-based issues. And so that escalation leads to just a kind of a cacophony of service delivery that you can't pull together with just the number of people. So I note it because some of the questions that people have asked is like, well, what constitutes the need for out of district? And for us, that's a pretty unique placement when you look at 600 plus students and, you know, around roughly 41 outplacements. Those are pretty complex kind of special cases. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Great. Welcome to budget season. Thank you.
So just getting back to some capital planning, some broader capital planning discussion. So we're preparing for the capital plan, the 5-year capital plan, fiscal 24 to 28. And as a reminder, in the past couple of years, we've worked hard to try to pull all of our capital needs into one document. As you remember, it used to be anything over $500,000 was sat outside the capital plan in its own article. And so there were several things that didn't make it into or through the evaluation of the capital expenditure planning committee. So we've been working really hard on that. Kim's been working really hard on that with our committee. As you'll note here, there was a goal the select board created for me for fiscal 23, which is to recommend a schedule for long range capital needs. So looking beyond that 5 years. So Amber mentioned going to 10. We're looking out to see, what we might be planning 5, 10, at some point, maybe 15 years from now. Our management analyst, Owen Page, if you haven't met him, he started on the 12th and he's already spent a ton of time looking at documents that other communities use to really pull all of their needs into one planning document and also really have a long-range planning outlook so that we can really be evaluating our needs and our scheduling against other needs. In addition to the capital plan, which we always talk about at the budget summit and the budget hearing, we've done a lot of work, as you all know, in the past few years, creating planning documents, participating in assessments, and identifying new initiatives. And last year we had Jim Robbins, our town planner, talk to you about the master plan because it had been recently adopted. And we had Pete Dunbeck from Sustainable Westboro talk to you about the capital plan the climate action plan because it had been recently adopted. I think it's really important to bring these back to light because they are things that we've invested time and money in. There's some things that our residents have invested time in and money in. And so, Westboro, I think, should be really proud that when we do these assessments and we create these plans, they don't sit on a shelf. We do work to implement them and we do work to responsibly make recommendations as we move forward. But they are usually new initiatives or new goals. And so, there's sometimes a cost to that, whether it be financial or the capacity of the staff. And so I just wanted to point these out. At the department level in 2018, we had the fire department organizational assessment, which looked at the organization as well as potential staffing increases. We haven't talked about that assessment in a long time, but it did go out to, I believe, fiscal 25. And so there is identified need for additional staffing in that plan that we have not put in place. In 2018, we also created a strategic plan. In 2018, we also created the strategic plan, so that's actually really a town-wide plan. That was something where we had a lot of town engagement. And from it came 21 initiatives, which we talk about every year. So we talk about that in our budget document. We're very detailed about where we're at on each of those initiatives. When we put up different warrant articles at town meeting, we go back to our strategic plan and remind the community that we're in line with that. And then every year during the retreat with the select board, I give them an update as where we are each spring on our strategic plan initiatives. In 2021, we also did we got a grant to do the LRP program, so local rapid recovery, and that identified 10 economic development initiatives. So we have identified some funding through our economic development revolving fund. We've also awarded some Arpa funding, and we will talk about this in a little bit, but we also have identified some state funding for some of these initiatives, but they are initiatives that are new and that do cost money. Some other townwide plans, we have the 2021 BWALT feasibility study. So as most of you know, I provided an implementation plan to the select board earlier this year. And so we expect that development plan to be incorporated into the capital plan beginning in FY24. As a reminder, these things that we're putting in the capital plan, it's supposed to be all capital requests and regardless of funding source. So just because it's in the capital plan doesn't preclude it from seeking grant funding or other alternatives. So certainly with the BWALT, we've talked a lot about grant funding and state funding, and that would still be the intention, but again, trying to put all of our capital requests into one document. In 2021, we adopted the Climate Action Plan, which identified 10 goals with multiple strategies, and the Sustainable Westboro Group is working hard to reach those goals. One thing that was identified as a priority, actually in fiscal 23, but that was deferred, was the need for a sustainability coordinator. Currently, we don't have anyone on staff whose responsibility is to do a lot of this work, and so that was identified in the Climate Action Plan as a need. And then the 2021 Master Plan, so that's several goals, a 20-year plan over multiple categories. That implementation committee has just been seated, and it will begin this fall with creating priority of projects, and we expect to find some financial needs there, maybe in FY24, but certainly going forward. Then we have other assessments that are ongoing. So our IT department is doing a cybersecurity assessment to evaluate the town's needs related to that. That was funded by a grant. We're also doing an information technology assessment, which was also funded by a grant. So both of those I would expect to see requests for additional technology in FY24. In 2022, we're also doing the senior needs assessment. So that was funded at town meeting. We contracted with UMass Gerontology Department. That process is moving forward. They've completed several interviews, and the steering committee is completing the survey, which will go out to the community. Not only was that supported by town meeting, but that was also an initiative of our 2018 strategic plan. And then we're completing some more internal assessments. So our strategic plan at this point, we have accomplished a lot of the initiatives, and it's 5 years old at this point. So we want to do some internal updating of that strategic plan. And so we'll be coming forward recommending a process. Our classification and compensation plan has not been updated since 2018. So that's something that we would also look at. Chris talked about the public works capital and maintenance of assets, and then continuing to look at our capital plan and long-range capital needs. So as we talk about all these plans, oh, sorry.
I didn't know if you were at a break for questions.
Sure.
So I like all the assessments and plans. My question is, all these seem to be things that we need to add. Is there any assessment or planning going on things that we no longer need to do, we're doing inefficiently, or it's something, you know, basically you could back out of, because I don't think we can realistically just keep adding. So it seems like some amount of assessment ought to be on the, say, usefulness, for lack of a better word, on sort of everything else we're doing, because there might be areas where you could substitute some great new climate action plan thing for something that really is no longer as beneficial to the town.
So some of the plans that are up here, which is as we go into talk about staffing, specifically the fire department organizational assessment, as well as the non-public safety staffing study, both looked at efficiencies that could be recognized by making changes in operation. I would say that the technology assessments that we're looking at are similar, where we can, where can we achieve improvement without maybe gaining cost. In terms of services, that's sort of, we offer a certain level of service. We haven't necessarily done any sort of evaluation of, the community. As long as the community continues to use the services, we continue to provide them. The hazardous waste day is a good example. That was something that we had pulled from the budget for, I think, 2 years. As a result of COVID, and it was something that we pulled out of the budget to specifically ask the community if they were interested in funding that, and they did vote in favor of that article. But we have done the assessments in terms of operations with these staffing studies.
And Christy, one that just popped in my head because we talked about it. The select board meeting is the ad hoc or whatever, waste management task force, which is one that's ongoing. It wasn't here, but the plan that group is putting forth, and we just approved their charge, whatever we called it, charge, I think. But that's kind of a year-long process, really, to look at how we manage and handle waste in town with some recommendations to come forward. But that's one about an evolution. Can we be more efficient? Can we save money, et cetera? So, yeah, but I think, Walter, I think that it's a great thing to look at, but and to keep in mind, and where we get efficiencies and making sure when we get efficiencies that we eliminate.
So I jumped sort of into staffing. So we had 3 staffing plans that I had mentioned. And so as a result of these staffing plans in fiscal 23, we had initially had several requests for additional personnel. And so these were deferred, but the need for them hasn't gone away. So we have in the community development office, there was a proposal to create a new position that would meet zoning administrative needs as identified in the staffing study, and then also climate action plan work as identified in the climate action plan. In the Council on Aging, we had a request to increase the hours for 3 different positions. Information technology, there was a request to increase the part-time GIS administrator to a 30-hour-a-week position. In the police department, there was a request for additional officers per their staffing plan. We did move forward with Arpa funding, but that's certainly a pressure that we'll identify for fiscal 24 as we start to move those individuals onto the FY24 budget. And then in the fire department, there was a request for a fire captain and also a second administrative assistant or a part-time administrative assistant. We also are aware of fiscal 24 personnel requests, so these would be new. And that would be the 4 additional firefighters. That's something that came out of that assessment in 2018. Chief Purcell has applied for the SAFER grant, which, as you remember, was something that would fund additional firefighters. We did that in 2015. We funded 8 firefighters, and they incrementally came onto the budget. The SAFER grant was intended to be more robust with a funding of at 100% over a certain number of years, but we haven't heard back on that. The request for these additional firefighters was also a proposal for Arpa funding, which was not awarded. Community development, we still have the need for the sustainability coordinator. That's a position that we expect would go into that department. And then in Public Works Department, there will be a request for a maintenance craftsperson funded through the water and sewer budgets and an additional one funded through the general budget. These are just requests. We're not putting them forward at this point. We know there's a lot, but we just want to identify budget pressures going into fiscal 24. Answer any questions about that?
Can you speak to why the fire department, when they requested funding through ARPA, were denied funds? Can you speak to that or no?
I can. So we'll talk about ARPA at the end, but we had put forward, we did an evaluation. The finance team put forward a recommendation, and the advisory finance committee reviewed the recommendation and recommended to the select board who awarded. So one of the things that we were concerned about doing was awarding to proposals that would have alternative funding sources. And at the time, the chief had already applied for the SAFER grant when we were awarding. All right, so in summary, when we look at the town and school budgets, we talked about the pressures of salary and wages and contracts, health insurance, Opeb, inflation related to goods and services, addressing maintenance of assets, student service costs, capital, and then personnel requests. So we've identified a lot of pressures as we look towards FY24. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up tonight is the select board in fiscal 2014 had set a goal of the budget not increasing more than 2% above the previous year's operating budget. This was something that we had talked about in 2019, that we had not met more than we had met that goal. And so at this budget summit in 2019, there was discussion among the three boards about the need for reevaluating that goal. Is it reasonable? What should it be? And then COVID happened. So we didn't have that conversation, but I think, this is probably the time to have it. This is certainly, as we look towards sort of all these competing interests and lots of pressures coming from different departments and different directions, something that the select board, I think, would be interested in having that discussion again. And typically the way that this is implemented is that when we put out the budget message to all the department heads, we let them know of the board's 2% goal and ask them to make their budget requests around that goal. So I don't have a recommendation for what the goal should be, but I did want to resurface that discussion.
Possible to modify this chart?
Can you speak in the microphone? Sorry.
Would it be possible to get a modification of this chart that shows what the actual is?
Yes.
Thank you.
I absolutely think it makes sense. Actually, Christy and I talked about it earlier too, but I do think from our perspective, that goal was set a while ago. I think it was fair when you look at the early years. We really focused on it. We were able to meet it. We have not met it in the last, whatever it is, 5 years there. So the question is it realistic, not realistic? But I think setting parameters and providing those in a budget message makes a lot of sense. So I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have and to think about. Part of what we're doing tonight is identifying pressures in those pieces. But I think, as we all know, and we will hear a lot more when tax bills come out in January for February 1st. November 1st, people are like, oh, it doesn't look that bad. February 1st, when they have to make up the difference for the last two payments, is going to be when we're all going to hear it. So I think it's, taxes are on everybody's mind. I think it's important for us to work all together to figure out how we deal with those pressures that we're receiving from residents in the town who are concerned about escalating costs and escalating tax bills. But I'd love others' comments, thoughts. Andrew.
I think there's a lot of assumptions, especially around things like this 2% goal, and it's come up in some of the presentations around the funding to level set the current services and keep those the same going forward. As these price pressures continue, I wonder if there's a time to start asking the question, what if we don't level set services, and are there services that we think that we can pull back on in some places so that we don't have to cut in others? And every department, that means different things, whether it's snow plowing or number of people who are at the police station or number of teachers. But I think that the underlying assumption has always been level set services. If part of this is that the town's getting too expensive, where's the conversation about maybe we need to change some of those service expectations? Just a thought.
Just to respond to that, I think we did hear that a lot from the Finance Committee as we were preparing our FY21 budget. And, as we moved into COVID, I think the Finance Committee was really able to see the impact of some of these big cuts and then what that meant going forward as we tried to continue to provide services and pull things, back in as we move forward to restore our budgets. So, I'm not saying that we can't sort of look at our services. I think we do. We do every time we prepare our budgets. But I do think that you saw an impact during COVID we cut, I think, $2.7 million from our budgets. But then as people came back online, we needed to increase those to continue to provide services.
Alan.
One other area that we're asked about on a pretty regular basis, and it is an initiative, is looking at regionalization. And we do have some very successful regionalized service agreements. Some of those provide additional coverage for services so that we don't have to add additional staff to cover vacation time or sick time. I think our veteran services regionalization has been very successful in lowering cost as well as improving the quality of service to the veteran community. Even more recently, Chief Purcell's been leading a regional effort looking at emergency service and first responder dispatch. And what we've learned from that is regionalization can be incredibly complex, and it only works if other people in the region want to do it. But I think I can speak that there is still a commitment to look and explore opportunities for regionalization as those opportunities and willingness arise.
So we also have regional animal control, and we were able to bring a public health nurse on as part of a regional effort as well.
Think about the sewage treatment plant as a regional effort.
Correct. Other questions? I guess I'll jump in here and kind of go on Andrew. And people have heard me say it before. It came up when we were dealing with our kind of education on tax rates and single tax rates, split tax rates. But I think it is time we have to look. I think that people say, oh, we have a tax problem, we have a tax problem. Well, the reason we have a tax problem is we have a spending problem. And we got to look at spending. So I think it's a fair thing. I think we've got the group of people here that either elected or appointed that are in roles that can have that conversation. But I do think it's important. It's also important to educate. And I think, as Christy said, every time we come up with ideas, residents say, well, you can't cut that service. And the small one was hazardous waste day. Yes, it doesn't have a big impact on the budget, but it's like everything we talk about, you get the uproar that, well, no, don't take that. Look at something else. And so they're hard decisions, but at a point we may come to that point that we all have to think about what, those difficult decisions are, or the town can keep complaining, but they're going to keep paying too. So I think it is worthwhile discussions for us to have.
Ian, I think just to build on what you're saying, I think we need to do a better job with respect to making a distinction between needs and wants in the town. We can't keep building and adding on, as Walter was alluding to, with respect to services that we're providing. And perhaps we need to take a stronger look at the possibility of starting, and I'm going to just say this, zero-based budgeting, which forces us to look every year at what we're spending and why we're spending it, and not just keep adding on. So we need to educate, I think, the community with respect to needs and wants, and I think we need to take a look at the budget process itself and how we go about creating these budgets and assessing the services that we're providing. It's not a short-term fix. It's got to be something over the long term.
Steve?
The school budget is roughly 83% salaries. I was wondering what the percent of salaries on the town side of the budget is.
Close.
I have to look it up. Yeah. It's going to take me a minute to look it up, so I don't know if you want to take another question.
While we'll look at that other.
While she's looking that up, the reason why I bring it up is that to follow up on the Finance Committee's comments, simply with inflation out there and the need to increase salaries to people, I mean, that's a trend there's nothing we can do about unless we go back to the, I guess, 1913 before the IRS showed up. And therefore, wages prior to that were fixed. You know, if you got a loaf of bread, the cost of the bread was the same. And everybody that was before that in the chain of producing the loaf of bread, their hours were fixed in terms of salary. We can't do that in today's economy and won't ever be able to until, I suppose, there's a revolution or something else happens. So the idea is that the ability of the town to raise money and equalize what services we have, I think, is a better way to look at what we need to do going forward. And of course, what's behind that is the suggestion of needs versus wants. But, you know, if we expect somehow or another to have equity in taxes, the only way we can do that is have equity in services. And we can't keep on adding things that cost the town money and then have to pay for those, quote, increases in the tax base by virtue of the services that we need to supply. So continual growth of the town, in my opinion, is not the way to go. The way to go is to figure out how we can have an equitable tax rate without creating drivers that cost us more money. So those are thoughts that I leave on the table for everybody to think about.
I have a second question for you, Chris, but you look up the first
No,
one.
it's okay. Go ahead.
I guess the question is, in your view, or anybody else's, what's kind of the next step for what you had up on the screen before in terms of furthering this discussion? I mean, I don't think we're going to come to an answer tonight, and I don't think that was the plan.
No, that was not the plan.
Something we take to the finance team next? Is it something we...
Yeah, so what we would do is work with the finance director and the sort of internal finance team to provide materials to the finance team. That's typically our process anyway, that we would go to the finance team and make it some evaluation, and then we would take it to both boards.
Yeah.
Yes, Lisa.
You know, I think you have to go back to the expectation of our citizens. You know, if you lower the expectation of what the services, especially when we talk about the schools, then there has to be an expectation that we would lower the services that we offer. And we don't find that out very often from the people who we are meeting their needs. We don't hear them very often say, can you please lower our services? We often hear the opposite. Can you increase our services? Can you add this to our school system? We don't seem to have this. And you're right, is it a want versus a need? But if you don't start regulating the expectations of what people want for their school system, so that's where we're representing, then that's where you have a really tremendous issue. So if you decide to go this route, it really will have an impact on what we're hearing, which is the opposite. We hear people want more and more. But if they only need a certain amount, then that's the level that they would receive if we went this route that you're talking about.
Yeah, I just add though, because we hear the same thing, and you know, we hear that we want more, but then they always follow with, we want more, but we want to pay a lot less. And that's that balance that is different. I think we all hear that. It's, you know, kind kind of what can I get for free? Yes.
Any of those around?
No.
You know, in some respects, we set expectations for the citizens of this community. So I don't think it's just a one-sided perspective. I don't think it's just everything is being generated from below and moving up. I think we have some play in this where we set expectations for the community. And so I think it's incumbent on us to look hard at what we're advocating, proposing, as well as what we're hearing from the community, and try to find the balance, because we have to start applying some critical thinking as well. We can't keep spending the way we're spending. We have to begin to start asking what's important, and why is it important, and why is it more important than some other competing request. So it's a double-edged sword, and we have to try to find that middle ground. I know I'm mixing metaphors, but that's...
No, and I think it is important. We've talked about it before. We've tried different things, and I'm not sure how successful we've been. But if I take kind of like what you're saying, I think part of it is, end of the day, it's the residents. I mean, and town meeting. They vote. They are the body that does that. But giving them scenarios and saying, do they want? And at the end of the day, if they say thanks but no thanks, then you go back and say, well, this is what it costs. And but I think we can come with hopefully some discussions, educated discussions, and see if there's things to present. But then at the end of the day, when we bring it back, we can definitely lead there, but they have to agree and vote that as well. So I think we all know that. I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know, but it's something that in my too long tenure of finance committee and select board, we've tried it numerous times, and it's a difficult one to get through, because at the end of the day, people, I think Lisa, you said, they don't want to give things up. They want more, and I think the expectations are unrealistic. But to me, I think it's just the timing now. I've heard it more than I've ever heard it in terms of the impact of taxes on folks. And we've talked about it as a select board, but I'm really concerned. As I said, when that January 1st tax bill comes out, it is going to be a loud outcry, I believe, from the town, because they're going to see substantial increases that while we've tried to educate and tell them to expect it, when that number and that sticker shock comes there, we're going to hear it.
I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate here and say that I'm really concerned that some of this budget pressure is because of past deferred maintenance, and I don't want to see more deferred maintenance pushing this can down the road and costing, future residents even bigger stresses. Because at some point you have to pay for things that you signed up for, whether it's the sewers or the roads or the buildings. There's real cost to things, and the longer you put it off, typically the more it costs to fix, repair, replace.
Yep. Amber.
Comment just as an employee. I mean, I think these are really important discussions. I also think from a realistic side of beyond just wants and needs, and to articulate, tax concern at that level is a dimension of some of the expenditures we make that are choice. But we're currently continuing to face an expansion of growth in the town and numbers of burden on the services that we have to provide. So the expansion of police, the expansion of fire demands and the calls and the work come from the increase of businesses in town. The increase in housing impacts us. We want and need to provide a level of service that represents this community, but we don't have choice around the volume. So it's a dimension of discussion to say we want to limit taxation, but I don't get to call and ask 10% of my kids to leave, and you don't get to call and ask 20% of the businesses to pack up and go to Shrewsbury because they're pulling on our services. So there's a realistic discussion about whether or not we want to build something that's choice, like a community center. Fine, that's a realistic want and need discussion. Repair of Capitol buildings, as she said, deferment of those costs is costing us more and more and more, and we are in a spiral on some of that. And we stopped and we did some really meaningful upgrades to our municipal buildings, and we're paying for it right now. So you had a giant enrollment growth in the schools, which you're now tracking a head cost on, and you had the municipal buildings that we've upgraded. And then you have this growth of business. We have added businesses, and you hear this articulation, when is the relief going to come that we've added these businesses that would give us, the residents, a relief on our taxes? And we don't necessarily see that, for good or for bad. I'm not judging that. But we don't get to choose that they aren't calling the police and calling the ambulance service and requiring things of the community. They're driving on our streets and they're using our services. So we do need to maintain the town, and it's expensive. So I do understand then as a resident, the discussion around cost, but it's not as simple as want and need. I think I would ask us to categorize them with more depth. We need our plumbing systems to work. We need, and that's a huge impact with all the businesses in town. So again, I guess I just feel like I respect the conversation, but some things aren't choice. And there's this implication that everything we come to town meeting for is choice and we're making bad choices. I don't consider we've made bad choices. We choose to live in the town. The choice we make is to live in the town. And that's a choice as much as any other choices. And so for me as a resident, I choose to live here, accept that cost, and recognize that it comes with services. And as an employee, I don't get to pick the demand for service. And I think that's the separation I would expect us to make in the discussions.
Other comments or questions?
Yeah. While I agree, Amber, with much of what you just said, I think the struggle here is the needs and wants are as diverse as the people in this room and the diverse as the community that we represent. There are people that are struggling, and they are obviously very concerned about their tax bills. And as Ian's pointed out, they're going to see those come January. And my question is, we very rarely, these three boards, these three committees, very rarely vote down articles. So the question is, what is our appetite moving forward? I'm not going to pick up anything in particular, but there have been things that have been more wants, in my opinion, and I think probably most of our opinions, but we've still voted for them as committees, which, to Michael, your point, is representative to the rest of the town. So I think we do have to have that hard conversation about what is truly needed. Great example, the things that the various different departments need to function on a good basis to provide us the important services around police and fire are super important, and certainly schools. But there are other things that may not necessarily really truly be needed for the town and fall more into that want category. And I'm hoping that as these three committees look at these moving forward, that we really look at those, because there are people who are suffering and cannot easily move out of this town. They can't leave. It's too costly for them to leave. Or perhaps they've lived here their whole life and they want to finish out their life, but they're on a fixed income and they can't afford it. So these are all areas that I think we need to keep those people in the back of our minds when we look at these things, needs and wants, and be more representative as we make these decisions.
Anything else? I appreciate the candid conversation. I think and this is a start. I mean, this is not, I think everyone knows this is not going to happen overnight, but I think it's what residents expect. Those of us, as I said, that get voted in, and we have our areas of spheres of influence that we have in terms of what we're elected for and those that are appointed. But I do think we're the right group, along with the town staff, to have these discussions. And like we've had discussions on master plans and other stuff. So this is kind of I call it kind of our economic plan, maybe, or it's probably not a great word, but I think it's, having the candid conversations and see what we can do. Did you find an answer?
Oh, yes, 79%. So this is our FY24 budget process. This starts with tonight. This is the kickoff. The budget requests are due mid-October. The department budgets are initially requested in budget meetings scheduled in early October, with capital planning meetings happening throughout the fall. In early November is when we have the internal department meetings. The finance director and myself meet with each department head. And then the budget is due to all of you December 21st. The budget hearing is usually at the first select board meeting in January, and warrant articles are due. And then we have our other joint meeting, or budget summit, on January 26th, 2023. So it's typically that last Thursday in January. So I'm putting that out there now, because that is the all-day budget meeting that we typically have had. I was just going to give a quick update on Arpa Funds. So as everyone remembers, the Arpa Funds came to us. We were expected to receive about $5.6 million in Arpa money distributed in 2 rounds. We had 22 Arpa proposals exceeding $11 million. And so we did go through that process that I mentioned earlier with both the select board, the finance team, and the finance committee, and we awarded projects. This is just a list of all the projects that were awarded and have started to move forward. So the projects that have moved forward that are funded, or other projects that we expect to move forward, are funded at $5.1 million. As we talked about ARPA funding, we talked about the ARPA funding at the state level, with hopes that we would get some of that money to cover some of our needs identified through our ARPA process. And so we did get an earmark for the fire department washer and dryer, as well as the equipment washer. So that equals the $40,500 that had been awarded through ARPA. We also have an earmark in the economic development bond bill for $90,000 for wayfinding, which had also been awarded through ARPA. We're hoping that that bill is taken back up in October. And so we're putting that spend on hold, waiting to see the outcome of that bill. We also had awarded $275,000 for the recreational splash pad. We have some outstanding issues related to that project. The initial quote that was received, the vendor who had provided that quote had, I guess after we had applied for the park grant to create the matching funds, because the total quote was about $400,000, the vendor actually withdrew their quote. They're on the state bid list, and so they were able to pull back their quote, and they came forward with the need for additional design work, additional site work. And so we've put that project on hold as we talk to another vendor who's on the state bid list. And so we would come back to you before we spent any of those funds related to the splash pad, to give you an idea of the next steps and the actual total cost of that project. And that is my whole presentation. Do you have questions about ARPA?
So if there's a total possible remaining, the ARPA funds will use or lose, right?
Right, so they have to be awarded by the end of calendar year 24. So we would need to process through the rest of that. So we're waiting to see what happens with the economic development bond bill. And then the recreational splash pad, they're meeting with a new vendor. So we're trying to understand that cost and whether or not ARPA funds are still appropriate for that use. But we will need to go through the process to award the balance, yes.
On the LRP item here for 90,000, so it's listed as awarded, but that's not what I heard you say.
It was awarded by the board, but we're holding it as we wait for the state.
Christie, I don't know if you could give us a little update. There was $250,000 for a MassWorks matching grant. You can talk a little bit about that project as well, maybe.
So that project, the MassWorks grant hasn't been awarded yet, so we don't know at this point if we would receive that award. We applied for $5.5 million for that project, and so we would be waiting to see if it was awarded or if we got some partial funding, depending on how that would play out. So we expect that that award would come in October. So that would be another piece of that. So obviously, if we don't get the grant, then that 250 would also become available. Yeah. Yeah, so one of the things that we've talked about as we go through the ARPA projects is that if, these are the amounts that were specifically awarded. So if anything has come in, if quotes are different, I know Chief Purcell came and recognized a difference in his original estimate. And so it came back through the process before we moved forward, so.
And Chris, just so everyone's on the same page, back to the MassWorks thing, this is the one that, what we're waiting on, this is the match from the town, but basically that's for the Otis Street
yes,
work,
corridor.
the whole redoing of that whole interchange.
Yep.
Which, as we know, is dangerous. We're top 3 in the state in terms of dangerousness of intersections there, so.
That's the end of my presentation.
Anything else? Great. A motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second on our board?
Seconded.
All those in favor? Select board's adjourned. Everyone else can.
Motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor? Thank you for coming.
Deal with their adjourn too?
Yes, thank you. Before you all, guys, meeting Monday is here. Okay, amended.
I'll tell you, it's funny, I sort of looked at the warrant and sent me a note saying,
There is a.